For 35 years, he lived next to a locked barn, never daring to step inside. His wife insisted on it. After her death, he broke the promise, and what he saw was unbearable. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching this video from. When Andrew Mason first arrived in Kansas, he felt as though he had stepped into a world that moved at half the speed of the one he had left behind. The road stretched endlessly ahead of him, two narrow lanes cutting through fields of wheat that rippled like water when the wind passed over them. There were no horns, no sirens, no roaring subway cars or impatient crowds shouldering past. Here the silence was large enough for a man to hear his own thoughts again, and that was both comforting and terrifying. He had left behind a busy life in Chicago, a job in an office tower where the windows looked down on a maze of streets, where every day felt like a repeat of the day before. He had felt himself disappearing into routine, becoming invisible in the city he once dreamed of conquering. And then he had met Selena. He still wondered sometimes how it had happened so quickly, how two people from such different worlds could collide in a moment and know it meant something. She had been in the city only temporarily, taking care of an aunt recovering from surgery. He saw her for the first time at a corner cafe on a cold afternoon, steam fogging the window behind her as she cupped a mug of coffee in both hands. She had looked out at the street with eyes that seemed to hold an entire story no one else could see. There was a stillness in her that drew him like gravity. He asked if the seat across from her was taken. It was the easiest question he had ever asked in his life, and yet it changed everything. Selena was gentle without fragility, quiet without shyness. Her words came like carefully chosen stones placed one by one, building meaning slowly. She had grown up in the very farmland Andrew had entered that day, raised by the sky and the soil more than by other people. She was a woman who listened before she spoke, who remembered what you said even after you forgot. When she told him she would return home soon, he felt something seize in his chest, something that warned him he could not simply let her walk away. The months that followed were a blur of drives back and forth, long-distance calls that made the nights feel less lonely, and the first hints of a dream Andrew hadn't allowed himself in years, a life that felt real. He left Chicago with one packed car and no idea what came next, but he was sure of the woman waiting for him. Their home was a modest farmhouse on a quiet rural road. The paint on the siding had been white once, now dulled to the color of old linen by years of sun and storms. The foundation creaked like bones settling when the wind blew too strongly, and the porch leaned just a little to the right, as if the whole structure had grown tired of standing at attention. But to Andrew it looked like potential. It looked like beginning. They married beneath a branch that stretched over the backyard, just the two of them, and a local pastor who spoke quickly because the storm clouds were gathering. After the vows, after the kiss that tasted like rain, they rushed inside laughing. Andrew looked around at the uneven floorboards in the cluttered kitchen and felt for the first time in his adult life completely grounded. Theirs was not a life built on ambition or competition. It was a life built on mornings shared over coffee, hands brushing unnoticed when passing plates at dinner, the comfort of knowing that the person at your side would stay. But even in the most peaceful places, shadows find ways to grow. Behind the house stood an old shed. It was tall enough to walk inside without ducking, but not large enough to be considered a barn. Its wood was silvered by decades of weather, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle like the spine of an old man. When Andrew first noticed it, he imagined using the space for tools or gardening equipment, maybe even for a hobby someday if he ever found one worth doing. He had commented on it casually during one of their early evenings on the porch, saying something about fixing it up together. Selena had been stirring sugar into her tea, the spoon making soft circles against the ceramic. She froze for just a fraction of a second, a tiny pause he wouldn't have caught if he hadn't been looking at her. "I'll take care of the shed," she said, her voice light but final. "There's a lock on the door. Best not to go in." She did not elaborate, and Andrew, eager to maintain their newfound harmony, did not ask questions. In the first months, the shed was simply part of the scenery. He hardly noticed it during the day, and at night it was only a darker shape in the yard. But slowly, in the quiet spaces where curiosity grows, he began to wonder why she had locked it, why she had spoken with such certainty that he must not enter. She was not secretive by nature. Every part of her life seemed open and unguarded, except that. Time softened the edges of things. He learned the rhythms of their town, the way neighbors waved without slowing their trucks, the smell of fresh-cut hay, the thrill of thunderstorms that rolled in with lightning flickering like nervous thoughts. He found a small job fixing up tractors and fence posts for farmers who needed an extra set of hands. His Chicago muscles, once tense with stress, relaxed into the honest ache of physical work. He and Selena tried to have a child. They entered that chapter with the easy optimism of people who believe life is fair. First came excitement, then questions, then appointments that buzzed with fluorescent lighting and antiseptic smells. There were charts with rising and falling numbers, scans with no clear answers, doctors with apologetic eyes. They told the couple what so many others have heard: nothing is wrong, and yet nothing happens. Keep trying. Maybe it will come. Andrew watched Selena grow quieter each month, her hope thinning out like a thread stretching too far. He tried to reassure her, but reassurance can sound like false promise when disappointment has made a home in the heart. It was during this time that the shed grew from simply a building to an unspoken line between them. Andrew saw her slip out at night more than once, flashlight in hand, the beam bobbing across the grass like a wandering star. He would hear the distant clink of a lock turning, the almost imperceptible opening of a door, and then silence. She would return later, her expression blank, her hands trembling slightly. When he asked if she was all right, she would nod and say she just needed air. Boxes arrived once or twice a year, always addressed only to her. She never opened them in the house. Always they went straight to the shed. Once when she wasn't home, Andrew carried one from the mailbox. It was light but bulky. He could not tell what was inside. He set it down where she usually did and brushed the dust from his hands, wondering what he was not allowed to know. He tried to peer through one of the shed's windows once. The glass was clouded, layers of dust and grime obscuring anything inside. He wiped at it with his sleeve but saw only vague shapes, shadows of shelves or furniture. Nothing distinct enough to give an answer. He told himself that it didn't matter. A marriage did not need access to every thought or every room. People had their own corners, their own private memories. He wanted to respect her boundaries. Still, something in him tightened whenever he looked at that locked door. Despite small fractures in the foundation, their life continued. They cooked meals together, sometimes laughing, sometimes quietly existing side by side. On Sundays, they walked to the end of their road and back, talking about the weather, the crops, the small changes that stitched together a year. Nights were filled with the chirping of crickets and the soft glow of lamplight against old wallpaper. But even the strongest routines cannot mend wounds that remain unspoken. The subject of children faded from their conversations. The doctor calls stopped. Hope stopped. Selena stopped speaking about the future except in vague generalities. Andrew had always thought that a broken heart made loud sounds, shouting and accusations and slammed doors. But heartbreak often whispers, it hides. It makes one person retreat to silence and the other follow, because silence can feel like peace when the alternative is pain. The shed stood always at the edge of their sight, a reminder of a question neither of them asked aloud. In that small space behind a locked door, something was being built, or mourned, or preserved. Andrew did not know which, and every day he felt the weight of not knowing more. Years passed. Seasons changed over and over like chapters in a story. The wheat field behind the house turned golden, was harvested, then lay bare and brown until green shoots broke through again. They shared laughter sometimes, softness sometimes, but beneath both lay a mutual ache they could not name. Andrew still loved Selena, the way he had when he first saw her through the cafe window. If anything, he loved her more for the strength she carried, even if he could not understand its source. But there were moments, quiet ones, when he caught her looking at the shed with a sadness he had no language to translate. Moments when he felt like a guest in pieces of her life. One evening, as the sun dropped low behind the fields and the sky burned orange, he sat beside her on the porch. Her hands were folded around a cooling mug of tea. The cicadas hummed their steady summer chorus, and the air smelled faintly of warm earth. He glanced toward the shed, the lock catching the last glimmer of daylight. He wondered, not for the first time, what lay behind that door. A memory too painful to face, a dream too fragile to share, a secret too heavy to speak, he wanted to ask. He wanted her to let him in, to trust him with whatever part of her heart lived in that space. But her gaze stayed fixed on the horizon, and the gentle slump of her shoulders made him swallow the question before it left his tongue. If love was a house, theirs had one room perpetually closed. Andrew stayed silent, believing that patience was a kind of devotion, and that one day she would open the door on her own. He could not imagine that they were already running out of time. The evening after the porch, after the sun had melted into the horizon and the sky turned a bruised shade of purple, Andrew found himself awake long after Selina had drifted into sleep. He lay in the bed they shared, staring at the ceiling, listening to the subtle murmur of the wind outside. He could hear leaves rustling against the siding, the soft creak of the old house settling deeper into its foundation, and beneath all that familiarity lurked an unease he couldn't quite define. He could not have explained why, but he felt change moving toward them, like an approaching storm, slow at first, then faster with each passing hour. It began subtly. Selina started to tire more easily, blaming the heat, blaming age, blaming anything but herself. Andrew noticed the way her shoulders sagged when she thought no one was looking, and how she pressed a hand to her ribs as if supporting something fragile inside. Yet she continued her routines, tending to the garden, walking to the mailbox, disappearing to the shed under the veil of night. For a time he convinced himself that she was merely worn from stress, that the years of silent disappointment had taken their toll. But the signs grew too loud to ignore. He first insisted she see a doctor after she collapsed while washing dishes, the plate shattering on the kitchen tile beside her. The sound had been sharp enough to slice through the late afternoon calm. When he reached her, Selina was sitting upright but dazed, her breath shallow. She brushed him off weakly, saying she had stood up too quickly, but he could feel her pulse pounding like a trapped bird beneath his fingertips. That night, when she claimed she was just tired, fear planted itself firmly in his chest. The drive to the clinic was quiet. Selina leaned her head against the passenger window with her eyes closed, her skin paler than he had ever seen it. Andrew gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles blanched, as if his strength alone could steer them away from whatever truth awaited. Hospitals smelled like antiseptic and endings, and each passing minute in the waiting room felt like a grain of sand slipping irretrievably through his fingers. He remembered the doctor's expression before he remembered the doctor's words, the pause before the diagnosis, the way the man's mouth shaped itself around sentences no one ever wants to hear. Acute leukemia. Late stage. Aggressive progression. Treatment options were presented, but all of them came with more suffering than hope. Andrew sat frozen, unable to speak, feeling as though the floor had tilted beneath him. Selina listened with an unsettling stillness, as if this news was not unexpected, as if she had already accepted what he could not. When the doctor left them alone, Andrew tried to find anger, or even denial, but nothing came. He reached for her hand, but she withdrew gently, folding her fingers into her lap. She looked at him with a painful softness, like someone knowing they had only a handful of breaths left to choose the right words. "I want to go home," was all she said, and with that she decided the course of her final days. They returned to the farmhouse where the silence had already been trained to hold secrets. She refused chemotherapy, refused hospital beds and fluorescent lights. She wanted mornings with coffee, even if she could drink only a sip. She wanted to watch the seasons shift across the fields, even if she could barely rise from bed. She wanted to be surrounded by everything familiar, sunlight through lace curtains, the warmth of the porch railing beneath her hand, the quiet hum of crickets lulling the nights into calm. Andrew became her caretaker in ways neither of them had imagined. He learned to cook soups, though his attempts were often too salty or too thin. He helped her bathe when she no longer had the strength. He counted pills into a plastic organizer, as though arranging tiny pieces of borrowed time. Every hour was a negotiation with pain. Some days Selina woke with enough strength to sit on the porch and smile when a rabbit darted through the yard. On others she lay in bed, her breath shallow, her eyes half open but not really seeing the world around her. The shed, once a shadow only in Andrew's mind, became a looming presence. Selena still refused to speak of it, and she no longer had the strength to visit it at night. But her gaze drifted toward it often, as if there were a part of her still living beyond its locked door. Andrew wished she would trust him enough to let him into that part too. He wished that whatever she had hidden there could be brought into the open and eased before she was gone. One late afternoon, as the sky glowed with the golden warmth of early autumn, she sat by the window wrapped in a quilt, her body a thin outline against the fading light. Andrew knelt beside her, wiping her forehead gently with a damp cloth. She looked at him then, truly looked, and he saw resignation in her eyes. Not to death itself, but to the fact that they were both powerless against what was coming. She reached out a trembling hand and took his wrist, her grip weak yet resolute. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, each word requiring its own breath. "There's something I need from you," she said, and Andrew leaned closer, ready to promise anything if it would relieve even a fraction of her fear. "Promise me you won't go into the shed," she said. There was no explanation, no justification. It was not a request but a plea, an anchor thrown desperately toward a future she would no longer inhabit. Never. Not now. Not ever. Andrew felt confusion twist sharply inside him. Of all the things she could have asked, comfort, security, remembrance, she chose secrecy. It seemed cruel, irrational even, to tether him to a vow he did not understand. He wanted to question her, to demand the truth she had been withholding for so long, but her fingers tightened slightly on his wrist, the last flicker of strength her body still possessed, and he saw tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "I need you to promise," she repeated, and the weight of her words settled heavily between them. He nodded. It was instinctive, perhaps even unthinking, but absolute. "I promise," he said, and though his voice was steady, his heart trembled with the shape of a lie he might one day be forced to break. That night Selena did not speak another word about the shed. She held his hand until sleep took her. He lay beside her, listening to the fragile rise and fall of her breathing. Each motion an affirmation that she was still tethered to this world. The room was dimly lit by the glow of a small lamp, casting gentle shadows across the walls. Andrew stared into those shadows, wondering what truth lived just beyond reach. He wondered if love sometimes meant not knowing, if protection sometimes meant silence. But love, he discovered, can also mean losing pieces of yourself that you never meant to give away. In the days that followed, Selena slipped further into stillness. The illness stole her strength quickly, like a greedy thief. Eating became impossible, speaking too costly. She no longer ventured outside. The porch swing remained empty, swaying occasionally only when the wind dared disturb it. Andrew stayed by her side, nourishing her with gentle touches and whispered reassurance. He memorized every detail of her, each freckle, each line around her eyes carved by both laughter and distress. He counted every heartbeat by the rise and fall of her ribcage. On the final morning, the house was strangely bright. Sunlight poured through the curtains, illuminating the dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. Selena lay still, her eyelids half drawn as though she were watching a dream from a distance. Andrew felt a coldness creeping into the room long before she drew her last breath. Grief has a scent, a heaviness, and in that moment he recognized it completely. Her hand slipped from his without sound, without tension. She went the way she had always lived, quietly leaving behind a presence so strong that silence could not erase it. Andrew did not cry then. Grief sometimes comes late, unwilling to share space with shock. He sat beside her, his hand resting over hers, waiting for some final sign that she was still there, that she would open her eyes and say his name. But the world continued forward with indifferent momentum, and even the sunlight seemed to move cruelly across her face, erasing the last remnants of warmth. He made the calls, arranged the service, accepted condolences that sounded like foreign language, spoken through muffled walls. People said she was wonderful, that she had touched lives. They spoke kindly about her strength. None of them knew the secret she had carried alone. The funeral was small, a handful of neighbors, the pastor who had married them, a few faces Andrew could not place. The fields around the cemetery whispered with the wind, as though trying to soothe the sorrow carved into the earth that day. Andrew stood alone beside the closed casket, feeling both full and hollow, as though he contained every memory and also nothing at all. When he returned home, the house greeted him with the kind of silence that screams. Her mug still sat by the sink. The blanket she had wrapped around her thin shoulders remained draped over the arm of the chair. Everything smelled faintly of lavender and the remnants of a life interrupted. The bed, the kitchen, the porch swing, all remained as they were, but none of them felt alive anymore. And there, beyond the window, stood the shed, tall, unmoving, and locked. The promise he had made lingered in his mind like a chain, binding him not to love, but to loneliness. With each passing day, the question he had buried began to grow, fueled by the empty spaces she had left behind. Why had she insisted he stay away? What was she protecting? What part of her life had belonged to the shed instead of to him? She was gone. The promise remained. But promises, he would learn, do not dissolve with death. They transform. They become questions that demand answers, silence that demands truth. And sometimes they become the only thing a grieving man has left to break. The days that followed Selena's funeral blurred together into a single stretch of time that felt both endless and absent of meaning. Morning arrived because the sun insisted, but Andrew no longer woke with purpose. He moved through the house like a shadow searching for the body that once cast it. His footsteps were soft, hesitant, as though he was afraid to disturb the quiet she had left behind. He kept expecting to hear her voice from the next room, or the sound of her slippers brushing against the floor as she shuffled toward the porch. He would turn his head whenever the door creaked, poised on the edge of hope's cliff, waiting for a presence that would never return. The house seemed to mourn with him. The wind rattled the windows with a softer touch. The walls sighed as though breathing through sorrow, and every familiar room felt like a story cut off mid-sentence. But the shed remained unchanged, still, silent, closed. At first, Andrew avoided looking at it entirely. It stood like a gravestone in the backyard, a marker of questions and regrets. The promise he had made weighed heavily on him, and grief tangled into guilt every time his gaze brushed against that locked door. He had sworn to her, sworn in the dimming light of her final days that he would never enter. It felt wrong to betray that vow now that she was gone, but all he had left were doubts, 1,000 silent wounds, and a haunting realization that he had never truly known everything about the woman he loved. Grief is a powerful sculptor. It shapes the heart into strange forms. It teaches what loneliness is, makes the air around a person colder, heavier. It steals sleep and replaces it with nights spent wandering through memories and wondering what could have been different. Andrew spent many evenings seated at the kitchen table long after the stars had risen, his hands cupped around a mug of untouched coffee, gone cold hours earlier. He would stare out the window toward the shed, his thoughts circling around the same unanswered question. Why had she needed that door to remain closed to him? He tried to distract himself. He took long, pointless walks along the dirt road by the house. He attempted to clean, though each object he touched reminded him of her. A sweater still holding the faint scent of lavender soap, a pair of reading glasses resting by the bed, an unfinished crossword puzzle in the newspaper she had last held. Everything in the house was a testament to her existence. Everything in the shed was a testament to her silence. One night, nearly 2 weeks after she had been buried, Andrew was awakened by a sound he could not identify. It was not loud, more like a shift in the air, a quiet creak that echoed faintly through the walls. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, his ears straining to capture the sound again. The wind pushed against the windows, making the house groan. But beneath that familiar noise lingered something else, something coming from outside. He slipped out of bed, feet touching the cold floor with the hesitation of a man unsure if he was awake or dreaming. He moved through the hallway on instinct, guided only by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. At the back window he paused. The shed stood where it always did, but the door was slightly ajar. At first he thought it must be a trick of the night, a result of light and shadow blending into something misleading, but he blinked, unable to look away, and the image did not change. The lock hung loosely from the latch, unfastened, an invitation or a warning. Andrew pressed a hand to the glass, steadying himself. The world outside looked too still, as if holding its breath. He wondered if this was a message from Selena or merely the wind finally persuading an old lock to give way. The promise he had made returned to him, sharp and suffocating. It clawed at his conscience, insisting that he turn away, that he respect her wish even now. But grief and love and the weight of not knowing pushed harder. He opened the back door and stepped onto the cool grass. The night air wrapped around him like a damp shroud. Each step he took toward the shed echoed louder in his mind than it did in the yard. The closer he came, the more his breath faltered. When he finally reached the door, his hand hovered before the wood, fingers trembling. He hesitated, listening to the pounding of his own heart. He whispered her name, as if she might answer and free him from deciding alone. But the silence remained, and silence is a cruel decision-maker. He pushed the door open. The world inside the shed was not what he expected. Not rot, not rust, not forgotten tools or broken equipment. Instead, the warm glow of a small lamp illuminated a room carefully tended and strangely inviting. The walls were lined with soft paint, pale yellow like the early morning sun. Toys were arranged neatly on wooden shelves, stuffed animals with stitched smiles, dolls with button eyes, a row of brightly colored blocks stacked in perfect symmetry. In the corner stood a crib. Andrew stared at it, breath caught somewhere between disbelief and heartbreak. The crib was handcrafted. Smooth wood polished meticulously, each rail shaped with gentle curves. A knitted blanket lay across the mattress, the threads woven from familiar colors, his shirts, her dresses. He stepped forward, his knees weakening beneath him. Children's drawings covered one wall, taped in overlapping layers. The figures were simple but vibrant. A house with smoke curling from its chimney, a bright sun with long rays stretching outward, and 3 stick figures holding hands. 2 tall, 1 small. Above them, in uneven letters scrawled with a shaky hand, were the words, Mom, Dad, Me. Some of the pages had been crinkled by time, edges curled from the humidity of the seasons. Others were crisp, newer additions to a future that never came. On the small table beside the crib was a spiral-bound notebook. Its cover was worn, the edges bent and softened from being opened many times. Andrew reached for it slowly, afraid somehow that touching it would make the illusion disappear. The first page greeted him with a heading written carefully in blue ink. A mother's journal. He began to read. The earliest entries spoke of hope, fragile but growing. Plans for names she liked. Thoughts about how Andrew would react the day she'd tell him he was going to be a father. She described his smile as something she wanted their child to inherit. She wrote about imagining tiny footsteps echoing across the wooden floors of the farmhouse, and laughter filling rooms that had always felt too silent. But as the pages turned, the hope bent into sorrow. She wrote of doctor visits that gave no answers, tests that returned negative for everything except disappointment. She wrote of nights spent awake beside him while he slept, tears sliding quietly into the pillow as she wondered if she was enough, if she had failed him, if she had failed the family they had wanted so much. In one entry, ink smudged by watermarks, she confessed that she sometimes avoided his eyes after another failed month, not because she blamed him, but because she feared seeing her own heartbreak reflected there. The shed became her sanctuary, a place where dreams could live despite reality. She ordered toys and clothes, convincing herself that preparing for the future would make it come faster. When the doctors finally said their odds were nearly impossible, she turned the shed into the room of a child who existed only in longing. Each toy she placed on the shelf, each drawing she taped to the wall, was a prayer disguised as a gesture. Near the final pages, her handwriting changed, more fragile, the lines wavering as though written by a hand weakened by illness. She spoke of fear, not of dying, but of leaving him alone with the emptiness she carried inside her. She wrote that she could not bear to show him the nursery, could not let him see the shape of her hope, afraid that it would break him as deeply as it had broken her. She wrote that the promise she asked from him was not to hide something shameful, but to protect him from love that had nowhere to go. I kept this dream alive so we could have a place where our child would always be real, she wrote, even if no one else ever meets them, even if they never draw breath. This room is our love made visible. Please forgive me for not letting you see it sooner. Please forgive me for needing to believe." The final sentence, written with visibly trembling letters, brought Andrew to his knees. "You are the only father our child ever had." He pressed the notebook to his chest, the weight of every unshed tear finally collapsing through him. Sobs tore free from where they had been trapped for months, years perhaps. His body shook as grief and love intertwined in a single overwhelming ache. He knelt beside the crib, resting his head against the wooden railing as if bowing to a memory. He wept for the life that never came, for the woman who had carried love so deeply that it grew into a secret room, and for the promise he had never understood until now. Hours passed, and he remained in that space, as though time had chosen to fold neatly into the dust and lamplight. The wind whispered outside, rustling through the eaves, but inside the nursery the air felt warm, alive, full of soft echoes. He could almost imagine the faint laugh of a child, the patter of small feet circling the crib, a dream still lingering enough to pretend it had a heartbeat. Eventually the tears slowed. His breathing steadied, though the ache remained heavy in his chest. He rose slowly, his hand sliding along the edge of the crib, grounding him. He walked one last time around the room, touching each object gently, honoring the care she had poured into them. This space was her heart, the part of her he had never been allowed to see, because she had feared the weight it would place upon him. But now he understood. The shed was not a barrier. It was a love letter. Leaving the door open behind him, Andrew stepped out into the pale wash of dawn. The grass glistened with morning dew, each drop catching the early sunlight. The sky above the fields brightened into hues of pink and gold, the first promise of a new day. He turned to look back at the shed, now no longer a symbol of secrecy, but a place reborn into memory and truth. He knew he would return to that room again and again. He would not lock it. He would not hide it. It would remain open, breathing, existing as a testament to the family they had built through hope rather than reality. Selena had left him something more powerful than despair. She had left him a reminder that love does not disappear simply because dreams go unrealized. For the first time since she died, Andrew inhaled fully, the air filling his chest without splintering. The world was still broken in places, but it had light. It had remnants of laughter and glimpses of purpose. And as the sun rose higher, warming his face, he felt something new stirring within him. Not joy, not yet, but the possibility of healing. He would keep the nursery alive, keep her memory alive, and in doing so, he would keep the invisible heartbeat of the child they had loved alive as well. He walked back toward the house, his steps slow but firm. Behind him, the shed door creaked gently in the breeze, never to be closed again. In the days that followed his discovery of the nursery, Andrew found himself drawn to the shed every morning as though pulled by a silent force. The first rays of sunlight would brush the windows, and he would already be awake, watching the golden glow creep across the walls of the house until it brushed against the door that once held secrets too fragile to speak. The shed was no longer a place of avoidance or superstition. It had become a living part of his heart. He would push the door open and let the fresh morning air swirl through the small room, carrying the scent of grass and clean earth inside. Dust would dance in the slanted light, soft and shimmering like gentle reminders of the life he had shared with Selena. He always brought a notebook with him now, often the original journal Selena had filled, though he touched those pages with reverence, reluctant to take up too much space in the world she had created. Some days he brought a new book, its cover blank and the pages crisp and eager. He did not always know what to write. Sometimes it was a memory of her laughter when he mispronounced the names of local wildflowers, or the way she would curl her toes against the cold wood floor in the winter mornings. Other days he wrote to the child whose name shifted with every letter, just as Selena's had. He imagined a boy with bright curiosity or a girl with her mother's calm strength. He wrote of moments they might have shared, of nights sitting beneath the stars with a blanket wrapped around the three of them, of the first time they would have heard a giggle echo across the porch. He realized with quiet acceptance that he was not writing to fill emptiness, but to give love a place to rest. The transformation of the shed continued with simple, careful acts. He replaced the old bulb with a softer lamp that warmed the room into a gentle glow. He fixed the window latch so the breeze could come through without causing the curtains to flutter too violently. He cleaned the floor, polished the crib rails, and mended the torn ear of a stuffed lion that sat loyally beside the pillow. Every improvement was a conversation with Selena's memory, a promise that he would carry forward the dream she had tended in secret. Outside the walls of the shed, life beckoned to him slowly. Neighbors returned to their routines, but they looked at him differently now, with a sympathy that once felt suffocating. Yet the more time passed, the less pity he saw. People instead greeted him with gentle respect, acknowledging quietly that he was trying to rise from the weight of loss. He started going to town again, at first just to pick up groceries or fetch the mail. Each interaction felt awkward, like learning new steps after forgetting how to walk. But he forced himself to continue because Selena would have wanted him to. He could almost hear her soft voice urging him toward connection rather than isolation. One afternoon, as he checked out a few items at the store, the librarian recognized him and offered a warm smile. She spoke of a new children's reading program they were launching, a small initiative to encourage kids to enjoy stories together during the long summer break. They were struggling to find volunteers to help read aloud and organize the groups. Andrew hesitated at the idea, unsure if he could be around children without feeling the pangs of what he'd lost. But that night, while sitting in the nursery, he found himself reading aloud quietly to no one in particular, and realized he longed for his voice to be heard by someone who could answer with laughter or curiosity. The next day he signed up. The first session was both terrifying and disarmingly simple. A handful of children gathered on a rug beneath the library's front windows, legs crossed, eyes bright and eager. Their attention shifted between the pictures in the book and the expressions on his face as he read. Their energy filled gaps inside him he didn't know existed. And when one little girl shyly tugged at his sleeve to show him the drawing she'd made of a pig wearing a sun hat, he felt his heart swell with unfamiliar warmth. After that day, he returned every week. The children learned his name quickly, and soon they knew his favorite stories too. They asked him to read the silly ones twice, and the gentle ones slow enough to feel every word. He began helping with craft days and assisting the younger ones with learning to hold crayons the right way. The library buzzed with small joys and big imaginations, and some part of him, long buried, began to bloom again. It wasn't just the library that welcomed him. A bulletin board near the checkout counter displayed flyers from the local foster agency seeking community volunteers to spend time with children who needed reassurance that kindness still existed in the world. Andrew recognized that call. He wrote down the number. Weeks later, he found himself sitting in a room with walls painted in cheerful colors, surrounded by children who looked at him with curiosity instead of expectation. They neither knew nor cared about his past, his losses, or the shed that held his sorrow. They only cared that he showed up steady and gentle, just as they needed. It was strange, watching the world through the eyes of children again. Their joy came without caution, their tears fell without shame, and their love was offered freely to those who treated it with care. Andrew found healing in their presence, not by replacing what he had lost, but by learning that love does not diminish when spread, it grows. One evening, while organizing donated toys at the center, he found a jar of folded slips of colored paper tucked behind a bin of blocks. The staff member beside him explained they were wish notes. Children wrote down something they hoped for, something small enough to believe in, but big enough to dream about. Something inside Andrew cracked open at the idea. He thought of Selena's jar in the shed, filled with names and imagined futures, folded carefully by hands that trembled with fear and love. There was a parallel between the children in the center and the child she had dreamed into existence. It felt like connection, like a thread pulling him gently between past and present. Day by day, Andrew's world widened. He still visited the shed each morning and often again at night. He still wrote in the notebook, but his words began to change. They were no longer filled only with longing and ache, but with quiet gratitude. With stories of kids asking questions too big for their age, or the surprise of a hug around the waist from someone who trusted him despite knowing nothing about him. With reflections on how he could keep Selena's love alive, not by holding it tightly, but by letting it flow outward. There were moments when the grief surged unexpectedly, a lullaby overheard, a photograph found in a drawer, the sudden scent of lavender carried by a passing breeze. But even in those moments, he felt Selena's presence not as a weight, but as a hand resting gently on his shoulder. As summer ripened into autumn, the fields behind the house turned golden once more. The sun lingered longer in the evenings, stretching shadows across the grass like soft reminders that time kept moving. Andrew continued volunteering, often walking home through the quiet roads, his steps more sure, his chest less hollow. He began tending the garden again, planting flowers he knew Selena had loved. With every small act, he felt the roots of his life deepen rather than fade. One late afternoon, he returned from the center with a lightness in his stride. A young boy had asked if he would be there next week, and the simple expectation had filled him with meaning. The house stood calmly against the setting sun, its windows glowing with reflected warmth. The shed door was ajar, as it always was now, welcoming rather than forbidding. Andrew set his coat inside and walked across the backyard. The air was crisp, carrying the first hints of the colder seasons approaching. When he stepped into the shed, the room embraced him like an old friend. The crib's shadows stretched across the floor. The stuffed animals sat patiently. The journal rested open where he had left it. He sat in the old rocking chair he had brought in weeks before, the wood creaking beneath him as he settled. Outside, the sun slipped lower, casting copper and gold light through the window. He exhaled slowly and felt a peace he had not known in years settle into his bones. He picked up his notebook and wrote a single line. "We are still here, and love is still alive." His handwriting was steady. There was no tremble of uncertainty. He closed the notebook gently, placing it beside Selena's journal, as if the two belonged together, pages of their hearts intertwined across time. He looked around the room, and for a moment he imagined Selena standing by the crib, her hand resting on the railing, her eyes bright with hope rather than dimmed by sorrow. He imagined a small child nestled in her arms, a child who existed not in reality, but in every loving intention they had ever shared. He smiled. The sky outside deepened into a brilliant wash of amber and rose. Birds called to one another from the trees, their songs turning the evening air into something alive and sacred. Andrew stood and moved to the doorway, letting the soft breeze brush against his face. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He knew life would continue to test him with reminders of loss and uncertainty. He knew there would be days when the house felt too quiet again, when the ache returned with unwelcome sharpness. But he also knew something much greater. Now love does not disappear when the person who carried it is gone. It transforms. It flows forward into new hearts, new hands, new moments that can benefit from the tenderness that grief taught him. Selena had left him more than memories and unanswered questions. She had left him a legacy of hope. The shed no longer represented dreams that died, but dreams reborn, dreams that would grow in the smiles of children he had yet to meet, in the warmth of stories read aloud, in the simple act of showing up with kindness. As the last light of sunset slipped below the horizon, Andrew whispered into the gentle hush of evening, not as a plea, but as a promise of his own. "I'll keep loving," he said, "and you'll always be part of that." The wind rustled the nearby wheat, as though carrying his words across the fields and into the sky. The stars emerged one by one, quiet witnesses to a heart mending itself through purpose. Andrew stepped out of the shed and pulled the door only halfway closed, leaving a gap wide enough for morning light to find its way inside once again. The world around him breathed, soft and forgiving. And as he walked back toward the house, he knew that though his life had changed, though part of him would always long for what might have been, love had not ended. It had simply taken a new shape, and he would honor it by living. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Share this video with someone who needs a powerful reminder that love never truly ends. And when you're ready for more, click on the next story waiting for you right now. You won't believe what happens there.